Quarters of the Murim Union. A group of students had completed their training in martial arts. The first son of the Murim Union leader, Yang Jagak, was a peerless genius among the students. He was titled the 10-strike star because he could deduce the correct way to counter any martial art technique in just 10 strikes. He was proud of his ability and showed it off every chance he got. But something was going on in the shadows of his union that would completely change his life. A political war was going on in the shadows of Murim Union, and he fell victim to it. There were many factions inside the union as well as outside it. The most notorious of them was the unorthodox connection. The fight over the heir to the position of the union leader meant that he was the first person to be eliminated. His tea was poisoned, and he died before even completing the 3rd decade of his life. A man draped in red and blue wakes up in an empty cave. He screams, wakes up, and is shocked to find that he was still alive. He was Yang Jagak, but how had he survived poisoning? He feels a recurring pain in his chest, and he thinks that it must be because of the poison. He concludes that he was not killed but kidnapped. He looks at the cave he was in. It was man-made and had luminous orbs to light the way. He concludes that this must be the work of some wealthy faction, but he cannot deduce who could have done this as there were many enemies. He finds the exit is completely blocked, but there is a big bag of grain beads. There are provisions that could last him for a long time, and he can feel that the air circulation is also there. That meant whoever had put him there did not want to kill him, so he decides to recover and gain strength. He sits to gather his Kai and pledges to defeat the person who did this, but he finds he cannot cultivate his Kai. The more he tried, the more his pain rose. He decides to drink water to help with the residual effects of the poison. While he is drinking water from the fountain, he looks into the pool of water below it. He cannot recognize his face. This is how the story of his reincarnation begins. He is shocked on finding that he does not know the person whose body he was in. He is not even sure if he was a man or woman now, but a quick peek clears his doubts. He was still a man, but he was not anything like Yang Jagak. The energy in his body was too impure, and there was no technique similar to his own in the body. He cannot think of any answer and realizes that this was the first time he had felt so lost. But he calms down and starts thinking about things rationally. He was not kidnapped. His soul had entered the body of a man training in isolation. He searches the cave to find anything about the training and soon finds it. A huge room is filled with sketches of a martial arts technique. He realizes that these were the instructions the person was following. The drawings were at least 100 years old, but he could clearly tell that the art was vicious and unique. He starts learning it and realizes that it was indeed the greatest martial art he had ever known. But he notices what the master of the body inscribed on the walls of the cave before dying. You can only grow stronger by facing danger, his message said. But Yang Jagak realizes that it was the wrong way to master the technique. The owner of the body had tried to force his Kai into the wrong areas and died because of the overload. But a genius once called the 10-strike star could not make the mistake. He decides to name the martial art Rebellion of Heaven, as it was the greatest martial art on earth. He learns all the steps, but it has been several years since he came to the cave. The drawings ended after the 10th star of the art. There was nothing more he could learn in the cave. He was much stronger than in his previous life and also gained 240 years worth of Kai. He had hoped that he would surpass his father's achievements one day but could not get the chance. But this art gave him so much more power than he had imagined. He decides to honor the creator of the martial art by never straying from the path of justice. He would serve the creator of this art as his disciple and pledges that his feeling will never change. He finds that there was no other way to leave the cave but to break through the entrance. He uses his technique to break through the door and feels that no matter who kidnapped him, he was strong enough to defeat all of them now. As he comes out of the cave, the light of the sun and the fresh air make him nostalgic. He spots a man sleeping nearby and decides to ask him more about the place. He wakes up the man and he is slow on the uptake. But his eyes grow wider the more he sees the man who had walked out of the cave. He screams and falls on his back. All he can do is scream, and Yang Jagak thinks that the man was mute. He asks the man if he could not speak, and the man is extremely terrified that he had done something unforgivable. He starts begging for his life, and Yang thinks that he was being mistaken for a bandit. He tries to calm the man down, but he screams and starts banging his head on the ground. When Yang holds him, the man faints immediately. Yang decides that he was just unlucky to find such a coward, but decides to move on. He notices a huge building that was probably some sect. He decides to go to the building to ask the people what they knew. The guards at the gates are all strong warriors, and Yang wonders what could be in this place where such powerful people were just guards. They approach him and he decides to fight if it came to that. But the guards bow down and congratulate him for completing his isolation training. But what surprises him is that they call him Young Leader. He is shocked on finding that this body was someone important, but then he tries to find what place was it. There is a board at top of the gate that tells him the answer. He was in the Guangmayan cult. Yang Jagak is terrified upon learning the truth. He had only heard about it in the stories. The cult was situated in the mountain range called 100,000 Great Mountains. It was rumored that once a person entered it, they never returned. It was notorious by another name for the entire world, the demon cult. Yang Jagak, a man who always strived for justice, the son of the Murim Union leader, was now the young master of the demon cult. He begins to tremble upon realizing what it meant. The training he had completed was the infamous heavenly demon god martial art. Yang had realized this, but the real damage was done when the guards remind him about the art. His whole life seemed to be a lie now. The man he thought to be his master was none other than the founder of the demon cult, the heavenly demon. Yang cannot believe it, and he loses all sense of his surroundings. He grabs a guard by his collar and starts crying and screaming. He cannot control himself and collapses as the guards try to calm him down. Foam comes out of his mouth and he faints that he had become the heir to the demon cult. Young Jagak wakes up in cold sweat. He is still holding on to the terror he felt when he learned that he was the young leader of the demon cult. He is in a lavishly furnished room that tells otherwise, but he still hopes that it all turns out to be a dream. He looks into the mirror and starts crying again. He curses himself that what sin did he commit for him to be punished like this. Inside the black floor palace of the cult, a girl is getting ready. She is Dan Yewa, the second daughter of the master of the black floor palace, Dan Yoonghak. Her attendant is getting her hair done, but she is disturbed by the princess's fidgeting. The girl known as Ice Princess is angry that the young leader returned and curses him. She adds that the 3 years without him were the best time in the cult, and that would continue if he had just died in the cave. The nurse tries to warn her about her choice of words, but Yewa repeats them even more loudly. She was engaged to that man long ago and she absolutely hates him. The nurse feels relieved that the princess would be able to marry him finally, but she gets angry at the nurse also. But Yewa did not expect anything good from that man. The heavenly demon god art was so hard that it was no wonder he failed. That is why he burst into tears at the gate. The nurse tells Yewa that she should try to be more understanding for the sake of her future husband, but Yewa replies that the man was just a pervert who used his status to molest women. The nurse says that he is so handsome that it makes her forget whatever bad things he does. Not many years ago, Yewa also felt the same when she saw the young leader. She had approached him one evening, but his behavior was devilish. He asked her to massage his feet and then tried to molest her. That was when the illusion of infatuation broke for her. It was only 4 years ago and she hated him ever since that day. She shouts that if he was a man he should have stayed on his promise and died in the cave if he could not master the martial art. But he was shameless and came back crying. She admits that she would rather die than marry that man, but she has no choice in the matter. The attendant tries to calm her, saying that maybe the young leader had changed in the last 3 years. Yewa is trembling at the thought that she had to visit that despicable man today. Meanwhile, in the small Mayan castle, young Jagak is contemplating everything he had learned in the last 4 days he was in the castle. The original master of this body was Ma Chunso, a man whose character was unacceptable by Young's standards. He was nicknamed Small Lust Ghost because of his actions. He did anything he wanted and got away with it because his father was the leader of the cult, the demonic being Ma Tipinam. He was known to be one of the 3 supreme beings that stood above everyone else in terms of power. But the status of young leader was just a title and had no authority. Ma Chunso never focused on training or social skills and wasted his life lusting after women and alcohol. The small Mayan castle was his home and the only good thing about him apart from his looks. But Yang had heard a lot of bad things about the young leader in the small talk of the servants. He was hated, and rightly so. And the servants believed that the next leader of the cult would be a Yul Jin. Yang believes that Ma Chunso never had the chance to learn the heavenly demon god technique. He might have died from alcohol if he had not died from the wrong training. But the body was only 19 years old, and only 3 years had passed since Yang had passed away. There was so much Yang could do, but there was no point in thinking of returning home to Murim. Young Jagak had no more energy to resist his fate. He decides that he would live as the young leader of the demon cult, but he would live like young Jagak, and not like Ma Chunso. But as he is saying that to himself, his reflection in the mirror twists and he can see Ma Chunso talking to him. He taunts him that he could not stay here as young Jagak for long and would gradually turn to be more like him. Yang is creeped out, but the illusion is broken when the door to his room opens. Yewa enters his room but does not look at him. He asks her who she was and she is dumbfounded upon hearing that question. Yang realizes that he was too polite for acting like Ma Chunso and gets a little rude with his words. Yewa goes ballistic when she learns that he had forgotten her face. She does not know that the person is not the lustful man she knew. Yang looks at her attire and thinks that she must be a servant because she wore plain and work-oriented clothes. He tells her to do her job and leave the room. Yewa gets angry at that and Yang debates whether he should behave more politely with her. But he thinks that he is acting like Ma Chunso right now. He should be at least this rude to a servant. His back is against her and when he looks at her, he finds that she was crying. But before he can confirm what brought about that reaction, she leaves and slams the door behind her. Yang thinks that even the servants here had an attitude. But Yewa's beliefs are more certain now than ever. She would really die rather than marry a man like him. Yang gets hungry and decides to go out of his room. There was only one other person who lived in the small Mayan palace, Yultek. He was the young leader's bodyguard and friend. But he was also a person of dubious character like his master and friend. He was the only person he had met in the last 4 days, and everything he knew was thanks to him. But Yultek thinks that his friend still lacks the negative energy to function properly. He thinks that his behavior was more like the people from the Orthodox sects. Yang is worried that his secret might be out if this continued. But Yultek was just joking with him. Yang moves closer to some plants Yultak is growing. Yultak was shocked when the young leader does not thrash his pots but compliments the plant's smell. He thinks that his friend had a loose screw and imitates how he usually talked. But before Yang can ask him more questions, his stomach growls and they decide to eat something from a good restaurant. Yang is already drooling on hearing the dishes served in the restaurant, but Yultak tells that they should change the destination. The Mayan cult air gathering was going to happen later in the day at the same restaurant, and Yultak advises his friend to not go. But Yang decides to see what was happening with his own eyes. He is cheerful and pleased as they are heading out, and he asks his friend about the structure of the cult. The Mayan cult was divided into 9 palaces, 2 Mayan palaces and 7 side palaces. The leader of the cult resided in the main Guang Mayan palace and Ma Chunso in the small one. The 7 side palaces were supposed to be supplementary forces, but in recent times, they were rivals to the Guang Mayan palace. The leader of the cult was missing, and the 7 palaces decided to elect a new leader, taking advantage of his absence. Yang knew that the leader had disappeared and left a note asking not to be searched, but he says that he, the young leader, was still there. But Yultak is brutally honest. He tells his friend that he was weak, stupid, and did not have a character worthy of being a leader. He says that even he would not pick Ma Chunso as the next leader and scoffs. Yang still has episodes where he forgets that he was Ma Chunso right now, and gets angry at Yultak a moment after he realizes that all the insult was aimed at him. But Yultak is quick to turn to flattery. He says something about the heavenly demon god martial art, and Yang remembers his pledge to call the creator of the art his only master. Yultak tells him that there had to be at least 1 million people that followed the demon cult in the Central Plains, but most of them were normal believers and not skillful in fighting. Yang cannot believe it, but his friend elaborates further. The emperor only ever cornered the Mayan sect and labeled it as the demon sect because he was worried about their influence. The Muramunian, unorthodox connection, or other sects were never cornered as they could not compete against the empire. Yang also realizes the truth in this statement and thinks that the Mayan sect was almost a country in its own right. He asks if the 7 side palaces took the governing roles too. They did, and Yang is confused why they waited for 2 years to overthrow the current leader. Yultak explains that the palaces wanted to, but the power balance stopped them from doing anything reckless. The elders of the normal cultists formed the 3 pillars of power along with the 2 Mayan palaces and the 7 side palaces. They were waiting for the Mayan cult heaven festival, which happened once every 2 years, to come together and make a decision. But the young leader's return also complicated the matter. When Yang asks why there were only the 2 of them in the small Mayan palace, Yultak tells him that he kicked out everyone else for silly reasons. And Yang understands that the challenges he would have to face here were all because the previous owner of the body was a wicked person. But the more concerning thing was that the power balance could be disturbed if nothing good came out of the gathering today. And if that happened, the entire country could become a war zone. Yang realizes that even though Yultak was a no-good person like Ma Chunso, he cared about his friend. He advised him to not go to the meeting because the others would insult him. That was his redeeming quality. But he could not let things be done and watch from the sidelines. He had sworn to walk on the path of justice and would make sure that he would walk it even as Ma Chunso. He only had 2 options, either to change the demon cult or to destroy it from the inside. He is excited to make his first move and rushes to the restaurant along with his friend. The Mayan Chun restaurant had been booked for the people of the 7 palaces for the day, and other people were not allowed in. The heirs of different palaces come to the restaurant. There is the second son of the Poison Palace, and then the second daughter of the Black Floor Palace, Danyewa, also known as the Ice Princess. Everyone considered her to be one of the most beautiful women in the world and is eager to see her. There are a lot of people inside the restaurant and they are mesmerized by her beauty. She never participated in social events, but today was an exception. She was here for a purpose of her own. Ma Chunso was not the only man in the cult. There were other men, better men. She would find someone suitable for her and ask him to marry her instead of him. That could save her from being tied to the young leader. But the men she finds on the first floor are not to her liking. She can find some very obvious faults in them and decides to try her luck on the second floor. The people on the second floor were more influential people from prominent families, and there was bound to be someone good there. With these thoughts, Yewa walks to the second floor of the restaurant. Will she find a good man and propose to him? What will be Yang's reaction that he called Ma Chunso's fiancé a servant? And will he try to make any effort to win her heart and correct his mistake? The answers would appear to be in the next video of the series.